And get started and start the recording. Again, welcome to the North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Outlook and Summary for June of this year. And before we get started, my name is Doug Cluck. I work for NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. My partnering with Dennis Toddy from the USDA, Midwest Climate Hub, and our presenter today is Aaron Wilson, the Ohio State climatologist. And we will start in just a moment, but I wanted to encourage folks, if you have questions or comments throughout the presentation, put them in the question area of your the platform here, and we can we'll take those questions either sort of as we go. Don't put anything in the chat. We tend not to monitor that, but the question part we do. That way we can kind of look back and see what kind of questions people are asking, or you know, what we may be missing that you want to comment on. So put everything in the questions section. We'll get to those when Aaron's done. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron. Aaron, take it away, and thank you very much for doing this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you, Dennis, also there. I really appreciate the opportunity once again, join the North Central region and talk a little bit about our climate and drought, how things have been going, and certainly some of the things that we see perhaps unfolding over the next month or so. A couple of photos starting out really kind of capture what a lot of us across the North Central region have been feeling over the last month. A lot of us seeing some rapid drying conditions. So certainly the lawns taking a hit, looking more like August or so out here in the east. You know, impacts on young trees, and of course some crop stress showing up, and we're going to talk about all of that as we unfold here today. Of course, this is you know, Climate Service that's brought to you for the North Central region U.S. Really a collaborative effort among a lot of agencies and groups that we work with throughout the region, with NOAA, the National Centers for Environmental Information, National Weather Service, the National Integrated Drought Information System as well. Thinking about the climate hubs, as Doug mentioned, the state climatologist, of course, our regional climate centers, both in the Midwest and High Plains, and the National Drought Mitigation Center. Next month will be Trent Ford, the Illinois state climatologist, on July 20th, providing an update. And as he mentioned, hopefully all drought will be done by then. I highly doubt that, obviously, but certainly that webinar will be coming up next month. You can always access future climate webinars, and this one included, at the links that you see there. And just to reiterate what Doug said, you know, we're open for questions here at the end, so enter them along the way. So now, being in the North Central region, as usual, we've always got a lot of things to talk about. We've got such an expansive area, and it seems like what's happening out west is a little different than here in the east, and vice versa. And that's certainly the case here for this monthly webinar. So per usual, we're going to talk about some recent conditions first and get into a few issues and events, get into hydrology a little bit, the hydrologic impacts on agriculture, more information about fire conditions, especially around the Great Lakes, and then get into the outlooks, hot off the press outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center just this morning. So a couple more photos here, just you know, kind of highlighting what we're seeing around the region. Pretty easy to find dryness impacts. This is from Ray Wolf around the Quad Cities area. Pretty low stream flows. We're seeing that across a large portion of the area as well. And of course, we cannot escape the wildfire smoke across all of our region this summer so far. This is a MODIS satellite image showing plumes of smoke that are kind of moving from north to south here across eastern Wisconsin into the Chicago area. Of course, northern Ohio, Indiana. This is just, you know, one snapshot, one day here, thinking about smoke across the region. I think all of us have participated in one way, one shape or another in that smoke this season. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we continue today as well. A lot of us are hoping for more scenes like this. Certainly cloud opening up. This is from Pete Boulay in Minnesota, looking at a cloud burst at Camp Riley north of Little Falls, Minnesota on June 3rd. So a lot of us could use a little bit more of this. I can't say much. It's certainly opened up here in Ohio over the last 3 or 4 days. But before that, certainly you'll see conditions were pretty interesting. I think interesting is the good word for it. If you're sitting there feeling, things are just a little bit weird. They're a little bit weird for the end of May, the beginning of June. We certainly are seeing what I would classify as some weird conditions for this time of the year. So we're going to talk a little bit of blocking meteorology 101 here. Blocking pattern, an omega block. You think about the Greek symbol omega. It takes that shape. The reason is basically it's an upper air pattern. Remains pretty stationary, and essentially what it does in the atmosphere, it prevents weather systems from moving through that typical west to east motion. We know the jet stream tends to slide a little farther across the northern tier of states and into the Canadian prairies during summer with a west to east motion. But with that blocking pattern, it's really kind of disrupted that typical atmospheric pattern. Underneath that high, you can get sinking air. It tends to be warm and dry. And of course, we've had a lot of wildfires across many parts of Canada, particularly in Alberta, and then also a little bit later, more recently out in Ontario and Quebec as well. So increased fire potential across Canada. And what that does, though, with that big blocking high sitting there, is it changes the flow. You can think of clock, right? We're going clockwise around the darker red area that you see on your screen. So we get these cold fronts that are sliding sort of south, even toward the southwest from the Great Lakes toward the Plains region. That's pulling up Gulf of Mexico moisture into places like Texas, Oklahoma, and then into the high plains. And you get these eastward moving storms in that region that's a little bit unusual. And certainly it's led to some interesting conditions, as we'll see when we look at the recap of May and this spring as well. So if it's feeling a little bit weird out there, weather-wise, from what you're used to this time of the year, this is the culprit here. This is what's happening. So looking at the May temperature recap here, you can see the rankings. This is based on 129-year ranks back to 1895, and for May, very warm, very much warmer than average, above average temperatures across the upper Midwest and northern Great Plains. So you can see top 10 warmest for Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. Above average from places like Colorado to Illinois, Wisconsin. So much of the region above average to much above. And then out here in the east where I am, it's been a bit cooler, about average to cooler in parts of Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan as well, kind of in that near average ranking over the last 129 years. And certainly this is a dramatic shift, right, from where we were looking at conditions earlier in the springtime. And that's really kind of captured with the March to May temperature recap. So despite having, you can see here, the 8th warmest May here in North Dakota, for instance, overall the March through May is still the 15th coldest, right? So it's a dramatic 15th coldest spring for North Dakota, despite that 8th warmest May. Just kind of big shifts across the entire region. So opposite of May alone, cooler in the west, warmer in the east, really shows how dramatic and how quick that change in the pattern has been. You'll notice no top 10 warmest. So still above average for places like Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and northward there in the east, but no top 10s this go around overall. So, as we say, kind of get a little bit closer to average, but average doesn't always, depict those conditions that we're experiencing on a month-to-month basis. And that's certainly the case this spring. What about precipitation recap here? So dramatic changes once again. Looking at an average to above average across really the Great Plains. So we're looking at, some areas here, North Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, Colorado, looking at above average precipitation for May. Whereas most of the north central region, certainly Minnesota down to Missouri and points east, have been drier than average, and some pretty big changes for places like Wisconsin. 4th driest May on record for Wisconsin. You got to go back to 1988 to have a drier May. And then the other 2 years, 1934, and the record driest is 1925 for that state. Only 40% of the normal amount of precipitation has fallen in Wisconsin for the month of May. And that was after the wettest start of the year, the January through April period. So again, some dramatic shifts and dramatic changes in our climate across the region. You can look at the county map. There's no driest counties, but a lot of top 10s throughout the state of Wisconsin. And as Steve Vavris, the state climatologist there in Wisconsin, noted no mosquitoes. So a good non-mosquito start there across the Wisconsin state there. Looking at the whole March through May, kind of the precipitation recap, a little bit different if you're looking at the entire season. Again, some of those average, different extremes averaging out a bit. But the northern tier of states, about average in terms of ranking across those northern tier of states. A little bit drier from places like Wyoming, Nebraska, certainly Kansas, and then extending eastward. So it was the 13th driest spring for Kansas. 2 counties there that you can see on the bottom left, or the left-hand side figure, 2 counties with their record driest counties. But there have been some dramatic changes there in Kansas as well, with a lot more moisture of late. And we're going to see that play out in some other indicators and things that we're going to look at. So that's sort of the climate recap. Getting into the more recent period here, looking at the last 30 days. Again, just really highlighting this opposite change or complete reversal from earlier in the spring. So you're looking at departure from normal temperatures, and these are in degrees Fahrenheit for the last 30 days. The oranges and red indicate above average temperatures. If you're getting into the dark green, blue, and purple, it would be below average. And then the lighter yellows and greens are really close to average. So looking across the northern tier, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Montana, very warm. Departures on average of 6 to 10 degrees above average. A few days getting up into 12 to 15 degrees above average as well. For the bulk of the north central region, looking at close to average, within a degree or two on either side of that average conditions for places like southern Wyoming, northern Colorado, extending eastward through Missouri, Illinois, and up into Wisconsin and Michigan. And then the greens indicating slightly below average in places like Ohio and eastern Indiana, southeastern Michigan, and then also back into southern Colorado through southern Kansas as well, tied to obviously some of the rainfall that's taking place there. So big changes, big gradients here across the north central region. Getting into precipitation, I'm going to step you through a series of maps that we're showing this time around. The top left is looking at precipitation in inches over the last 30 days. And so if you see the reds and the oranges, look, we're talking less than an inch of rain. And that can mean different things for different areas, obviously. And so we do show a couple of other maps to kind of accentuate that. I'm going to have you kind of jump to the top couple of figures on the right-hand side. This is just looking at pure departure from average in inches here for the last 30 days. And so where you see those red pockets in southern Iowa, southeastern Iowa, western Illinois, and northern Missouri, these are locations that are around that 4.5 to 6 inches below normal. They typically, for this 30-day period, expect a lot more precipitation for this period of time. And even the dark oranges across a large portion of the area from Nebraska, Iowa, all the way over to Michigan and Wisconsin, we're looking at 3.5 to 4 inches below. And so from a percentage standpoint, the darkest red pockets that you see in the top right figure, those are areas with sub or below 5% of normal rainfall. These are big deficits, especially for this time of the year. And the next slide is kind of going to get into why this is really important. On the flip side, again, it has been fairly wet, certainly very wet in portions of Montana, but closer to average, slightly warmer or slightly wetter, slightly drier than average in places in Wyoming and Colorado. Certainly the front range of Colorado and then over into Kansas has seen quite a bit more recent rainfall as well, more widespread across Colorado, western Kansas. And then even really recently, so now we're looking at the last 7 days on the bottom right, just to kind of give an indication of some changes even since this week and Sunday, some widespread precipitation across Ohio out here in the east. But if you look across much of the central plains outside of the front range of Colorado and Kansas, you see more of these pockets, almost popcorn-like heavier rainfall amounts in those yellows and reds. This is just indicating the scattered nature, which is something we typically experience in summer, more of the convective thunderstorm-driven rainfall. So this is, again, looking at some of these deficits. These are big deficits, especially for this time of the year. And why does it matter? Why are these deficits significant? Well, first, the map on the right is showing exactly, it's showing median percent of annual precipitation for different periods. The top is for May through July, the middle is June through August, and the bottom one is from July through September. Now, the easiest way to think about this is, when does the bulk of my annual precipitation occur? So you can look at where you're located on this map, and you can see that May through September really represents a significant portion of what we expect for the annual rainfall, the climatological precipitation totals for the year. So for instance, if you're looking at that May through July period in the Dakotas and eastern Montana, that's 50 to 67%, right, would be that median percent. Those dark greens are well above 40%, and most of the area sees a tremendous amount of their precipitation during this period. And so when we've got large areas, even in Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, that are missing the May and June rainfall, it's really difficult, can be really difficult to overcome that later in the summer season, again, as precipitation is driven by the pop-up and more scattered nature of the thunderstorms. And so this is why, we really want to highlight that although, we're starting to see impacts and things creep in for agriculture, the longer this goes on, the more likely those impacts are going to grow, and we're going to become more concerned with the impacts that we're going to show here throughout the rest of the presentation today. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the climate and the recent conditions that we've seen. Of course, we've had a few issues. I think the biggest, one of the biggest certainly is the wildfire smoke, again, with all the wildfires raging across Alberta and in parts of eastern Canada as well. This is a picture taken from a colleague of mine in Northeast Ohio. We had our retreat up in Geauga County in Northeast Ohio, but this is, you can barely see Lake Geneva there due to the wildfire smoke obscurity. So we see this kind of pattern repeating itself across the region. And this was pretty elevated wildfire smoke. There are a lot of areas that, have experienced, poor air quality conditions on the ground yesterday, today in parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, where poor air quality is noted because of that wildfire smoke. So certainly this is an issue this year across the region. A lot of headlines out there with the wildfire smoke. I'm going to play a couple of animations just looking at, again, you can see the impact of that almost southwesterly moving weather pattern here because of the blocking high to the north and west of us. But you can see the lighter beige color, just the smoke wrapping in at different periods of time. This is just this past week when we had a low pressure center moving through the Great Lakes. You can see the wildfire smoke wrapping all the way around this system and then all the way into the east across Kentucky into West Virginia. And so smoke has certainly been an issue, and it's been capturing a lot of the headlines that we've seen so far this summer. As far as heat goes, which is something, obviously we're in a meteorological summer now, climatological summer, either take your choice. We have had some heat, certainly for May and early June, but it's been rather limited in duration for a lot of us. The top left figure is looking at, these are records broken in terms of May average temperature records. A lot of those taking place in Montana and Wyoming, and a few scattered across Colorado and parts of the northern Great Plains as well. We've had a couple, I would say here in the east, a couple of hot days. We saw temperatures in the mid 90s to start off June. So a lot of high and also overnight lows that met the kind of high minimum thresholds as well. You can see the map in the bottom. Looking at that across the Midwest, but we haven't had a ton of records being broken, not certainly multiple days here, but this is just looking at the first week of June here from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. Along with that, though, a lot of places have noted very, extreme low humidity levels. Dew point temperatures, for instance, here in Columbus, where we had temperatures near 90, dew points in the upper 30s, and that's indicative of how little moisture was in the atmosphere. So you're looking at 17, 18% relative humidity, and even lower reports across some of our states. And so that can really, just indicate how dry the atmosphere has been. Some precipitable water values throughout the really low throughout the month. Precipitable water, you can just think how much rain could occur if all the moisture in the air condensed and fell as rain. But when those values are really low, especially for this time of the year when we expect humidity, when we expect rainfall, that can be a real problem in the Great Lakes region, obviously. The patterns also just kind of lended itself to a relatively calmer or lack of severe weather, at least widespread across the region. We've had some tornadoes, we've had some hail, we've had damaging winds, but perhaps a little lighter than we see this time of the year. Again, I would really kind of tie that back to that blocking pattern that we talked about earlier in the session. All right, so looking at hydrologic impacts, this is the mighty Wabash River. So several of us had the opportunity to be there earlier this year. This is taken on May 24th. And I think you can already see the impacts of the dry conditions that were taking place, kind of that shoreline kind of drawn back or from the river here. So certainly we've seen impacts on our rivers and streams, our soil moisture, and that's what we're going to dive into next. So a couple of maps to look at. On the left-hand side, this is the Climate Prediction Center's basically calculated soil moisture relative to historical percentile. What does that mean? Well, basically we're looking across the region, and where we see those dark reds, it's indicating that soil moisture is certainly below where we would expect it for this time of the year, and could be causing obviously some crop stress and stress to our lawns and gardens, et cetera. And just looking at the seasonal change there on the bottom, just the amount of the change in that soil moisture percentile since the end of March. And I think it really captures well the differences that have taken place across much of the north central region, from eastern Kansas, Missouri, up into Iowa, Wisconsin, versus what's happened along the high plains there out in western Kansas and along the Front Range. So the big changes in the soil moisture. And we could also see it in the USDA's topsoil moisture map here, looking at the percent of short to very short. This is for the week ending June 11th. So wherever you see these, 50, 60, 70% of the report, of the reports coming in as short to very short, these are pretty extensive, showing the dry conditions out there. And even with Michigan, looking at 91% of this short to very short reporting here, which is pretty astounding. And so thanks to Brad Rippey, the USDA Office of Chief Economist, looking at a time series map of several years here of Michigan topsoil moisture reports of percent to very short. So that bright red map or bright red line that you see is this year, 2023. And you can see it's sort of unprecedented for it's early in magnitude as well, the period of time and the magnitude. Although there are a couple of years in there that you'll see where the soil moisture percent short to very short does exceed where we currently are, but we'll see how that plays out over the next month or two as we continue throughout the upcoming season. Similar story here in Ohio, and not quite as bad as you get farther to the west, but certainly these are increasing percentages across North Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa as well. So showing really those a lot of the eastern and Great Lakes area that are drying out in terms of that topsoil. Turning now to kind of what we call the evaporative demand drought index. Think of it as the thirst of the atmosphere. This can really be a precursor for water stress across the region. So this is the 1 month look on the left-hand side. And so where you see the bright reds and the dark reds, these are indicating that the potential of moisture loss from the surface is pretty high. And so when you see later the impacts that we're seeing across portions of central and southeastern South Dakota and Minnesota, and certainly across the Great Lakes when it comes to fire conditions, this is really highlighting those areas pretty well. And the other thing on the right-hand side, you can look at the 1 month, the change in that value in terms of these categories. And so just as we're seeing these big rapid changes in Eddy across northern Minnesota, the Great Lakes region, just showing rapid onset drought conditions, we see just the opposite taking place across the Front Range and the High Plains there, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. So these are areas that obviously have picked up quite a bit of precipitation of late. And so that precursor for water stress has really decreased in terms of that demand. Looking at our stream flows, and these are basin based, so not just individual gauges, but just looking at conditions overall, we see above to much above normal levels across portions of the Dakotas, southern Minnesota, back into portions of Montana, Wyoming, again with these areas that have picked up a little bit more of the rainfall. But a lot of the oranges and reds that you see, eastern Kansas still, southeastern Nebraska, getting into Iowa, Missouri, certainly Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin, really looking at these stream flows that are falling in that below to much below normal, at least relative to the historical data. And really, we think this is really showing or amplifying, or is amplified from now multiple years of drought. Some places still have some of that moisture, what we call moisture memory. Think about Wisconsin, that rapid switch from the wettest start of the year to now, fourth driest May. There's still some subsoil moisture down there. But overall, we see some big impacts now taking place to some of these rivers. Thinking about the Kankakee for locations like Indiana and Illinois, some of these coming into some major population areas, the Fox River as well. So really get, with these dry conditions, starting to think about some other impacts, right, beyond just agriculture, but thinking about energy, thinking about water demand as something that can really accelerate based on these conditions. And so, again, thinking back multiple years of drought really causing some of the issues that we're seeing in our stream flows. Overall, when we look at the major river basins, the top left map is really geared toward flooding. And so we're not seeing widespread, it's no surprise, we're not really seeing a lot of widespread flooding. We do have flooding in the James. Think back to the heavier snowfall during winter and certainly precipitation early. And flooding in the James River there in the northern plains is pretty typical this time of the year. But outside of that, if we look at the Missouri, we had warm conditions up in the base, up into the mountainous regions that feed the Missouri, and that led to pretty rapid runoff. So the May runoff in the basin, Missouri Basin above Sioux City, was 4.9 million acre feet, or 144% of average. So rapid melting across those source regions. Today, the inflows to most of the, the main stem, what we call the main stem Missouri and the tributaries, it remains robust. So things are pretty good across much of that Missouri basin. With the Mississippi, recall, kind of this, again, doing this rapid flip-flop here from low flow last fall to near record flow in places of Wisconsin and other places across the northern tier, the northern Mississippi basin. We had that record or near record snowpack and that melt out, and we weren't really experiencing a lot of major water impacts across the basin. But now we're starting to get back into those low flow concerns, especially across the lower Mississippi basin from Cairo and places to the south of there. So it's becoming more of a concern now, again, based on these multi-year drought conditions, but starting to think about energy and water supplies. It's being monitored a lot closer now, a lot more, pretty closely by not that they never monitor it closely. We're always monitoring it closely, but the Army Corps is certainly starting to think about the conversations and talking about potential low flow impacts here. So there's projection there at Cairo to be down to the 10-foot level by the first week of July. So again, some concerns starting to creep up from a water supply, and not just the Mississippi, but the Ohio River as well. We've largely been dry out here in the east. Dryness has been more of an issue after a normal spring flood season. Again, we've had some relief here in Ohio, which obviously feeds, a lot of it feeds the Ohio River, but less so in Indiana and Illinois. So the word for the Ohio River is that below normal flows are likely to persist into July on the Ohio River. Snow, we all like talking about snow, and typically we'll show you the snowpack and how it's changing, but since most of it has certainly melted out, we're not going to do that today. We can get snow, obviously, in the higher peaks of Colorado and elsewhere, but a little bit of a surprise, as noted, was blizzard conditions on Pikes Peak this week. This was video taken by one of the peak rangers there, just showing, still finding snow falling, certainly combined with those high winds. And a nice picture from Becky Bollinger out in Colorado as well, west of the Continental Divide. So mountain snow is pretty much melted out. There has been some minor, or I should say some flash flooding and also river flooding. Of note was the Arkansas River hit major flood stage at Avondale this week, despite the moderate snowpack. So still a little bit of that flooding, but things have kind of already receded. Some minor flooding along the South Platte River, but overall that snowpack has melted out. Rivers have reached their peak, and we're not too concerned really with that moving forward, but does show you also the power of the rain this time of season, this time of the year. Looking at the Great Lakes really fast, of course, this is showing an animation of the temperatures across the lake once we get into May, and certainly the warmer conditions in June. We're warming up pretty nicely, but levels seem to be about where they should be. That's the map in the upper, or the graph in the upper right. One thing, we are getting our seasonal predictions for harmful algal blooms, so across Lake Erie, and right now the predicted bloom is for kind of this small to moderate bloom, largely because of the dry conditions that we've seen out here feeding into Lake Erie, but that can change if we do see a flip toward wetter conditions. There's still time for some of that runoff to lead to a higher bloom, but right now it's not looking like that. More small to moderate harmful algal bloom there. Lake levels across the Great Lakes have really peaked and plateaued almost, or they have, and started to fall in some places. They're all still above their long-term average May levels, but again, starting to fall a bit, and the forecast isn't really concerning really here for the Great Lakes. So that leads us to the new U.S. Drought Monitor that was released today. This is the national map, sort of the bullseye here in the central part of the country that's certainly impacting our states of Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Iowa, and then many areas to the east as well. I want to kind of zoom in a little bit closer and take a look at just the north central region here. So where you see the darkest red colors, that's the exceptional drought, the most extreme. On the flip side would be the yellow, being abnormally dry conditions, certainly indicating that things are trending in or out of drought, mostly into drought in some of these locations. So a large portion of the area seeing the at least drought conditions that start at D1. So currently we're seeing 37% of the north central region in the D1 category, with again over about 5% in that D3 to D4 range, parts of eastern Nebraska, parts of Kansas, and then Missouri. But we have seen some changes in that as well. So looking at the 4-week change on the right-hand side, where you see those darkest oranges in portions of Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, these are areas that have degraded 3 classes. They've essentially gone from no classification to D2 in those locations. And then again, on the flip side of that, across portions of western Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, we've seen improvements to the drought monitor there. So again, these cross north central region changes that we've seen across the region, but certainly a lot of us are feeling the effects of drought and even worsening drought in many areas of the north central region. So with drought obviously come along our agricultural impacts. This is a scene that's been repeated in these drought areas. Obviously, a big cracks in the soil, some impacts initially on early planted crops, newly emerged crops across the region. This is out of Iowa or eastern Iowa. So certainly, most of the corn and soybean across our region has been planted, and so we can look at the conditions now of good to excellent. So starting off in a positive, where are we seeing good conditions for our corn and our soybeans as well. So a lot of the negative numbers that you see on the bottom, these are changes from last week. So those negative numbers mean we're starting to see that percent of good to excellent conditions in our reports kind of slide a bit. We've got areas like Michigan that only 38% of the corn and 30% of the soybeans are listed in that good to excellent position, and they're sliding a bit too. So these are early indications that the crop stress is starting to creep in. I do want to make note that these maps that I'm going to show you are all available publicly each Tuesday at that link provided there. We can look at a couple of additional crops here, winter wheat conditions, which we're approaching harvest, and in some areas we've started to harvest. Really kind of another tough year for winter wheat, projected to be the 4th consecutive down year here in the United States in terms of production. The map on the left is showing those percent of poor to very poor conditions. So where you see the positives, that's kind of indicating decreasing or deteriorating wheat conditions. Where you see the negative, we're actually increasing. And so U.S. winter wheat right now, abandonment of that winter wheat is still pegged at about 32.6%. In terms of complete abandonment of the wheat, and that's the highest since 1917 and second highest on record. So this is a pretty big hit for the wheat. Again, we've seen the articles coming out about Kansas, obviously kind of the epicenter where they're even importing wheat into Kansas for the mills and stuff. And so we can see these big changes. Certainly the biggest yield impact so far because of the recent climate conditions has been on winter wheat, but others are suffering as well. We hear from Laura Edwards, a state climatologist in South Dakota, spring wheat really starting to struggle. It's heading out, though it's only about a foot tall, and even oats and barley being abandoned with those, again, rapid drying conditions across the central and east central portions of the state. Just like the precipitation change across the region, we've seen dramatic changes in pasture and range conditions across the region, looking at percent poor and also good to excellent. So when some areas where the good to excellent is sliding, percent of poor to very poor is actually improving. Conditions are improving, especially across southeastern Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, where dry soils, have really turned around. Soil profiles are full, and things are really turning green. So again, differences across the region. A lot of impacts, coming in across the state from experts and others that are kind of weighing in. High grasshopper, blister beetle, and tick populations across North and South Dakota, for instance. Several of these pictures that you're going to see, top left, looking at conditions in Missouri, where ponds, streams, hay, alfalfa fields are not looking great because of the low water, the reduced water inflow, and just not being able to grow a productive, second cutting, for instance, of hay or alfalfa regrowth, really struggling in many states. Even specialty crop impacts. U.S. tart cherry total production for 2023 is forecasted to be down 17% over last year. A lot of that takes place in Michigan. Warm winter, followed by some cooler spring conditions that we had in March, or certainly in April and in May, really kind of hitting that specialty crop pretty hard. But other pictures, the dry impacts on peas and strawberries, and strawberry quality has been a little bit decreased across many states as well. So again, crop impacts really starting to play out across the region. Importantly, fire conditions, especially across the Great Lakes, which may not necessarily be used to a lot of increased fire risk, but certainly that's taking place, and a lot of restrictions going into some of the national parks and things across the region. This is a picture of what's being labeled as the Dickinson County wildfires between Norway and Foster City, Michigan on June 7th. This area, this map on the right, in a value they call build-up index. Basically, think about the potential heat release. It's really just a long-term indicator of fire danger and how much fuel is available. There's a lot of it. And so there's a fuels and fire behavior advisory issued across all of Wisconsin, the UP of Michigan, lower Michigan, and then also much of eastern and northeastern Minnesota. So not typically thought of as a dry area historically, and certainly the trends have been wetter and wetter as we've gone in time here over the recent decades. But we're really going to have to pay attention to the fire danger here across this portion of the north central region. The latest outlooks extending all the way through August show that above normal wildfire potential across that portion of our region. Less really kind of normal conditions expected elsewhere. We're not seeing right now significant wildfire activity in a lot of the states that sometimes we do start to hear about this time of year, with a lot of focus again across the Great Lakes region up there in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All right, so now we're going to go into our outlooks, kind of thinking about where we're heading here over the next short term and long term, and how that might either help or exacerbate the conditions that we're seeing across the region. Of course, we've got to talk about ENSO, right? This is the El Nino Southern Oscillation and its status and projection. If you're with us, we always explain ENSO just a little bit. We're looking at the tropical sea surface temperatures out near the equator in the Pacific Ocean, relatively off the coast of South America. So if you're looking at the left-hand map here, you see where the oranges are focused, especially what we call a tongue of orange, or a tongue of warmer sea surface temperatures extending off the coast of South America. that can really connect to the atmosphere and make changes in the weather patterns across the northern hemisphere. And right now we have switched. We now have El Nino conditions, warmer than average sea surface conditions across this portion of the Pacific Basin. So they're above average, in East Central and Eastern Pacific. And right now, the official NOAA Climate Prediction Center probabilities that were just that have been issued in June, extending out through the upcoming summer, fall, and winter season, certainly show that El Nino conditions are expected to gradually strengthen through the northern hemisphere summer and persist into the northern hemisphere winter. Typically, we see strong connections between these conditions in our atmosphere during our winter time, and that's for somebody to talk about in a later webinar. But the speed at which these conditions are becoming prevalent could have impacts, may have impacts in our upcoming summer and late summer season as well. Certainly a greater than 50% chance of reaching this major or strong event status as we get into the wintertime. But what does that mean for our summertime? Well, it's important to note these are composites looking at the risk of basically climate extremes, and we're really focused on the July, August, September extreme maps here. It's important to note these composites are basically based on years in which El Nino has been present in the period of July, August, and September. And these are not forecasts, okay? These are average of past behavior and percent of increased risk. They're just a tool for us to think about how might those influence our outlooks in the season. Overall, the general behavior across much of the region is cooler, as you can see in the top left. So more tendency toward maybe cooler conditions across much of the north central region, and not as dry as say a La Nina phase, the cooler phase, if you will. So where you see the greens in that map, just indicating the behavior is likely, not likely, but under these El Nino conditions, there's an increased risk of seeing wetter conditions where you see the greens, right? Again, not forecast, but a way that we can think about and focus our attention on the outlooks. So short term, looking at the next 7 days, this quantitative precipitation forecast from the Weather Prediction Center. This isn't what will happen, it's projected to happen, it's our forecast. We're certainly in a busy June pattern. Despite that block, again, the conditions that we've seen, we do have systems that can move about the region. Again, more of that clockwise flow, and we see these systems kind of series of disturbances that will be affecting the plains and southern tier of the north central region as well. More rain potential. We see sort of that bullseye in North Dakota. Again, that's more just indicating we could see heavier precipitation in that portion of the north central region, which could be good for short-term drought relief. More rain potential, again, high plains, parts of the Dakotas. Not much for the Great Lakes. In poor Wisconsin, 7-day forecast at nil for much of the state, northern Illinois, and the UP of Michigan. So that certainly will not help the drying conditions, the rapidly drying conditions there. And what you don't see here is the overall pattern will likely lead to an more influx of this wildfire smoke throughout the northern plains and the Midwest as well. And so we've seen even the last couple of days, big air quality alerts across portions of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and that's likely to continue. Looking at the 8 to 14 day, and these are probabilities of temperature and precipitation, whether they're above or below what we typically experience. 8 to 14 day, a large portion of the north central region is leaning to or likely above as far as our temperatures go, especially across that Wisconsin, Minnesota area, where precipitation's also, at least in the near term, the 7 day is going to be light, but this is 8 to 14 day for June 22nd through the 28th. Lighter, or I should say weaker probabilities the farther south you go and the farther west and east you go as well. Precipitation wise, bulk of the Great Lakes really looking at near normal conditions for this 8 to 14 with just leaning or light probabilities toward wetter than average over the bulk. Again, these are not high probabilities here, very strong probabilities. Just keep that in mind when we're looking at the rest, basically the rest of June. Now looking at the July, the monthly outlook for July, and this will be updated at the end of the month from the Climate Prediction Center. Temperature-wise, much of the northern tier of states looking at really equal chances, no strong probabilities above or below, with the bulk of the north central region leaning toward perhaps warmer than average conditions, slightly greater probabilities in the northern Great Lakes region. This temperature map and also the precip map that's showing sort of above average, leaning toward above average for our far eastern colleagues like myself, but also from Montana, northern Wyoming, across the Dakotas into western Minnesota. Again, these are leaning above average for the month of July, but there's some consistency issues here. There's not a lot of strong confidence, I would say, perhaps lacking a little of that consistency and confidence in July. So we will get an update of this at the end of the month. Again, thinking about those INSO conditions, are we actually seeing an impact of that? There's a lot of uncertainty here to take into consideration. Looking at the July through September probabilities, more areas showing or leaning toward higher probabilities of warmer than average temperatures, equal chances again over the bulk of the northern plains. And then looking at the seasonal precipitation outlook, leaning below average in the Great Lakes again with that fire potential, with the impacts that we're likely to see continue. That would not be the best scenario for the upcoming season, but again, a little bit of uncertainty there, with even more uncertainty maybe across the Central Plains area, but certainly indicating that leaning toward wetter than average conditions for the July, August, September. And this is kind of a ridiculously early look at early fall conditions here as well. But I think we can skip on and not really put too much stock yet into this outlook here. So looking at the seasonal drought outlook that was also released, and again, there's some inconsistencies here to think about. If we do see a wet July, are we likely to see drought persist here in the east? Where does the wet weather set up? Summertime convection versus larger systems, a lot to consider here. Drought development could persist and increase across portions of the Eastern Corn Belt, Northern Great Lakes, could improve or maybe be removed in parts of the Central Plains. Again, I think there's a lot of things that we need to wait to see how the weather pattern plays out over the next month or two, but this is the current seasonal outlook as it is released today. So looking at the kind of summary conditions now, May temperatures were very warm across the northern tier of states, above average for most of the region and a bit cool in the east. And again, that's a big dramatic switch from what we saw earlier in the spring season. Very dry conditions for most of the north central region, Wisconsin and Michigan especially. Wetter than normal conditions across the western states, portions of North Dakota, the Front Range and High Plains. Soil moisture in rivers and streams have been impacted by ongoing dryness across the Central Plains toward the Ohio Valley. This is now raising concerns for the lower Mississippi and Ohio River basins, which are being watched pretty closely. Our crops are stressed, but yield impacts this time of the year with early emergence on a lot of the commodities are generally smaller, close to causing problems. I think Trent's going to have an interesting webinar coming up here in July. Winter wheat certainly has been hit particularly hard, and for places like Kansas that have been improving in terms of precip, it might be a little bit too late, too little, too late there. Certainly, we want to highlight the expanding drought and fire danger across portions of the north central region, particularly along the Great Lakes, and then also in South Dakota, portions of South Dakota as well. Not to mention the Eastern Corn Belt, as I've already mentioned. And so a lot of places to keep an eye on here over the next month or so. Weak El Nino conditions are present, likely to strengthen into the Northern Hemisphere winter. Again, our July outlook, probabilities leaning toward warmer than average across all but far northwest portion of the north central region. The precipitation is well leaning above average for Ohio and then the northern plains. Some inconsistencies there, but we'll see how that plays out. Not only for July, but for the rest of the summer as well. So that's where I'm going to wrap up today. Again, today and past recorded presentations are available at those links. A lot of our partners we want to thank, and the links that you can visit their sites and for more information as well. This is our information, not only my email and phone number, but our colleagues that are certainly make this possible. And again, I want to thank you for your opportunity, your time here and this opportunity, and turn it back over to Doug and Dennis for questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Very complete, even though you had like too many things to talk about, and that's been happening a lot lately. So, I can't apologize for the weather and the climate, but it's the way it goes. Okay, I'm getting an echo from, there might be you might have a phone and, okay. Anyway, as some stuff comes up, maybe you can chime in and I'll be quiet so we don't echo. So I'm going to go down the list of questions that we have. Some of them are, well, all of them are really good, but some of them are really pertinent for this particular one. One of the questions that we can kind of expand on a little bit is, are the unusual conditions, and in this case, he was talking about the blocking pattern that Aaron described earlier, the omega block, we call it, due to El Nino? And for the most part, the answer is no. We're just starting to see the atmosphere and the ocean, well, we call it coupling, or really coming together to behave like an El Nino in the Pacific. Okay, so we're sort of waiting, we're in the waiting process, and summer isn't the best time for those connections to occur anyway. Blocking patterns occur, and they can occur any time of year. This one's a little unusual for its strength, and I wouldn't say its position necessarily, but maybe how long it's lasted. They do last. That's the point. It's a block, and it lasts a while. But it does seem to be pretty strong and persistent, which is a little unusual. Do we want to say any more about El Nino and when we're kind of guessing that we'll start seeing some impacts? Aaron, you mentioned some potential for extremes in terms of cooler than normal temperatures and wetter than normal conditions late summer, early fall, right? You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I just think that that's, it's part of maybe a little bit of slightly decreased confidence in the seasonal outlooks right now, right? So really the next month or two, we're going to start to see how well those connect between the sea surface temperatures and the atmospheric pattern. And again, traditionally it's got bigger impacts, obviously, for us in the wintertime. So, I think Trent will probably have a good update on those conditions, and we'll know, how much that connection strengthens here over the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Thank you. Corn and soybeans can recover from precipitation deficits. We know that, but if we do receive more precipitation in July, will that fix the deficit? And I think this is more of how long can corn and soybeans last before they get precipitation, and when does it become important? And why don't you start that, Dennis, and then Aaron can chime in if need be.
Sure. Just a reminder that corn has the most damage you can do to corn yields occurs around its tasseling time in its phenological stage, or that grain fill period, which is soon after that tasseling time, which is usually during the month of July. So the stress that we've seen so far is not necessarily good for a crop, although it is kind of good because it's probably driving deeper rooting depths to be able to tap into moisture. We've probably not lost much yield potential yet, but we need to start getting rainfall over these driest areas soon, as in the next couple of weeks, to start removing this. I think as Aaron talked about, we don't think we can overcome all the soil moisture deficits, but a few timely rainfalls here and there, and we can still come out with a pretty good outcome from this for corn. Soybeans have a much wider window. They can muddle along until August. We're going to need precipitation for them in August. They don't have quite that same finite time of damaging their yield.
Right. Now, Dennis isn't saying no precipitation between now and July. I don't think you're saying that, Dennis. You're saying less than average until August or July or whenever, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the more precipitation, the better. But if you can get an inch every week or so, the crop is going to be as efficient as it can be at this point and can kind of limp along and still do okay. But because there's not much moisture in the soils, it's harder for it to get through these longer stretches when you don't have rainfall.
Yeah. Okay. Wildfire smoke question, sorry. Both from a crop moisture stress, because it's blocking out the sunlight, and maybe even touch on the good and bad. The good and bad. of smoke when it comes to crops, Dennis, and maybe even touch on the fact that we've been a little bit below normal in terms of temperatures in the Midwest, not in the high plains, not up north. Don't get me wrong, but as Aaron showed, it's been coolish a little further east in the Midwest.
You want to start that, Aaron?
Yeah, I think it's, thinking about, the good and bad, obviously. I mean, it's not good for air quality. It's not good for our health, obviously, with that. But in terms of smoke and impacts on crops, we know that it can have, pretty interesting impacts depending on how long and how much obscured the solar radiation is from reaching the surface. It can diffuse a little bit as well, but also there's those that are really strongly tied to obviously the amount of solar radiation. Thinking about beans and things like that, if you're not getting enough, can really impact growth. Combining it with the cool conditions, one thing I didn't mention that there are portions of where it has been cooler, where conditions have been lagging just a little bit, especially across that northern tier, Minnesota, Wisconsin. And also in Wisconsin with the soil moisture, there was so much of it that they haven't seen big crop impacts, right? From the extreme dryness that we saw in May. So it is a complicated kind of mix of conditions that we're seeing. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to that, Dennis.
Yeah, I just when you do have decreased incoming sunlight, that does decrease your potential warming for that day. And when we are as dry as we are, knocking a few degrees off the high temperature can reduce stress on a crop a little bit. So there's kind of pluses and minuses. I think the net is it's a negative for crop, but it's really not clear.
Okay. Moving on, as I wrote in the thing, people are asking if slides will be available and where they are and all that stuff. Send me an email, doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and I will get you hooked up. We don't have certificates, by the way, for attendance. If you want to write me, I will write you an email back saying thank you for coming. And then a couple other things popped up. Where am I? Oh, moisture conditions in Kansas for next year's winter wheat. That's a tough one. So let's pretend like we actually know what's going to be happening based on our El Nino likelihood, and let's talk about Kansas. And I'm not sure there's a lot we can say with El Nino in Kansas, although some may disagree with me. But any thoughts from either one of you on next year for winter wheat this fall? Maybe we can talk a little bit about precipitation this fall into winter, and maybe what El Nino may have in store for that.
Well, certainly the outlooks, if they do verify, and the near term would improve the soil moisture situation for at least winter wheat planting this fall. It would make the situation better than it was last year. Are we going to say it's a great year for winter wheat? No, we're too far away from that, and the deficits are too much. But at least things are headed back the right way to improve the planting conditions for winter wheat.
Yeah, we've got a whole summer to go through. Ask us that question again in September or October, and you might get a better answer, or you will get a better answer. As wildfire mixes with Arctic air mass, are there any expectations it will impact this winter's weather pattern, warming the air mass, and cause more and deeper dips in the lower 48 and the Arctic vortices and changing jet stream? Boy, that's a good question. I'm going to say, first of all, that smoke generally blocks of heating. So it actually acts as a blanket, as a reflector to a lot of the radiation of the sun. So in some cases, it won't necessarily warm things as much as keep them a little bit cooler. We know that. It also depends on how high that smoke gets in the atmosphere. Volcanoes, for example, really blow smoke, if you will, very high, and they act as a shield to radiation. So I don't think we have an answer, and I don't know if Dennis or Aaron want to comment on that. The smoke will be gone by then anyway if the fires go out. So
There's usually there's lots of things happen in our transition season, spring and fall, so that it changes the conditions from one of those seasons to another. So there's too much happens in the fall really to say too much about it.
one thing we might add in terms of Arctic vortices and getting cold, extreme cold air, like we had for a very short time this last winter. I remember it around the New Year's, and a little bit before that actually. With El Nino, we tend to see, and this is a tendency, 51% of the time, we tend to see less cold air outbreaks and less sustained cold air outbreaks as well. So doesn't mean they're not going to happen. It just means we tend to see less of them. The northern part of the U.S. tends to be a little bit warmer, tends to be a little bit drier, and the southern part of the U.S. tends to be a little bit cooler than normal and a little bit wetter than normal. That's a very, very simplistic way of looking at things. That's an El Nino. That's an El Nino characteristic. It's the opposite of La Nina in terms of what we see generally. Anything you want to add to that? Anybody?
Nicely summarized.
All right, that's all the questions we have. I do want to thank the 128 people. Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, Doug, just one more thing. The last slide that Aaron had Molly Wolazin's email on it. The email was incorrect. If you look in the chat, you can see Molly Wolazin's correct email. The B should be an end instead of that. So
we'll get it fixed next time.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very, very much, Dennis, and more so to Aaron, who did all the hard work. We'll listen to Trent. Trent, why am I forgetting Trent's last name? Trent
Ford.
Ford. Yeah, how can I forget that? Illinois State climatologist next month. Thank you all, and thanks for the thanks. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.